Bill Gates gave the world access to technology, but his own children grew up with strict limits. Those rules came at a cost in privacy, freedom, and access to a fortune most people can't imagine. In this video, I'm breaking down exactly what that cost looked like. Jennifer, Rory, and Phoebe Gates grew up in a house worth over $100 million, built by the man who put a computer on every desk in America. And none of them got a phone until they turned 14. That's not an exaggeration for effect. That's the rule, straight from Gates himself. In an interview with The Mirror, he laid it out plainly. We don't have cell phones at the table when we are having a meal. We didn't give our kids cell phones until they were 14, and they complained other kids got them earlier. 14, not 12, not 13. 14 years after most of their classmates already had one in their pocket, and the complaints were real. These weren't kids who didn't notice. They noticed. They watched friends get phones in 5th and 6th grade and had to wait years longer in a house where their dad could have bought every phone company on earth. Gates didn't budge. Once they did finally get a phone, the rules didn't stop. Gates said that even then, using cell phones while the family was having dinner was expressly prohibited. No exceptions. Doesn't matter whose birthday it was. Doesn't matter what app just came out. Phone stays off the table. Then there's the screen time itself, separate from the phone issue entirely. Gates and Melinda limited screen time to 45 minutes for games, with an additional hour allowed on weekends on top of the time required for homework. 45 minutes on a school night, in a house that could afford every gaming console on the market stacked to the ceiling. Gates didn't treat this as some abstract parenting philosophy either. He made it personal and pointed. He once said flat out, "My kids get limited computer time. Just because you're the daughter of Bill Gates does not mean you get to play on your computer all day long." That's a direct shot at the exact thing you'd assume, that money buys you out of rules. In this house, it didn't. Bedtime got the same treatment. We often set a time after which there is no screen time, and in their case that helps them get to sleep at a reasonable hour, Gates said. A hard cutoff every night, non-negotiable, enforced in a house owned by the guy who arguably did more than anyone alive to put a screen in front of billions of people. And here's the detail that turns this from strict into almost absurd. The Gates kids weren't just limited on screen time, they were locked out of an entire brand of technology. Melinda Gates said back in 2013 that her children receive Windows products, even though they sometimes clamor for Apple devices, explaining that the wealth from their family came from Microsoft. So why would they invest in a competitor? No iPhones, no iPads, no iPods. In a house full of billions of dollars, the kids were begging for a device their own father's company didn't make, and getting told no. That rule stuck for years. Even once the kids passed the phone-eligible age, they were still banned from having any Apple products in the house, thanks to Gates' longtime rivalry with Steve Jobs. This wasn't a passing preference. It was a standing ban that outlasted the age restriction on phones themselves. Gates has even admitted, almost sheepishly, that he notices what he's missing. Every now and then I look at my friends and say, "Ooh, I wouldn't mind having that iPhone," Gates said. The richest tech founder in modern history, publicly eyeing his friends' phones because of a rule he set for his own household. What's wild is that Gates wasn't alone in this, and knowing the company he kept tells you this wasn't some one-off quirk. It was a mindset shared at the very top of the industry. Steve Jobs had 3 kids with wife Laurene Powell, plus a daughter from a previous relationship, and every evening made a point of having dinner at the big table in their kitchen, discussing books and history. No iPad, no computer ever came out at that table. Jobs' biographer Walter Isaacson said it directly. The kids didn't seem addicted to devices at all because they simply weren't allowed near them at home. So you had the 2 men most responsible for putting screens into modern life, both drawing a hard line the second it came to their own kids. Gates explained his reasoning wasn't about hating tech, it was about controlling when and how it showed up. You're always looking at how smartphones can be used in a great way, homework, and staying in touch with friends, and also where it has gotten to excess. Gates added, there was a specific trigger behind the original screen time cap too. This wasn't some rule Gates dreamed up in the abstract. In 2007, Gates implemented a cap on screen time when his daughter started developing an unhealthy attachment to a video game. One of his daughters got hooked on something, and the rule came down for the whole house shortly after. That's a direct cause and effect. A kid gets pulled in too deep, and dad, who happens to run the world's biggest software company, pulls the plug. And it wasn't just phones and consoles. The no Apple rule extended to computers used for schoolwork too. This was a house where every device had to run Windows, every game had a stopwatch on it, and every dinner started with phones going into a basket or a drawer or wherever they went to disappear until the meal was over. Think about the daily reality of that. You're a teenager. Your friends are texting each other after school, trading memes, coordinating hangouts on a group chat. You don't have a phone to see any of it. You come home, you've got 45 minutes on a screen, and then it's homework, dinner, phone-free, and bed, with the Wi-Fi essentially cut off before you're tired enough to want it cut off. That's the house Jennifer, Rory, and Phoebe grew up in. Not a house without money, a house without exceptions. And this tech lockdown was just the entry point. It set the tone for everything else that came with growing up as a Gates kid. Because if phones and iPads got this kind of treatment, you can imagine what happened with chores, allowance, and the family fortune itself. That's where the next set of rules kicks in, and they get even more specific. If the tech rules sound strict, the chore rules might be even more surprising, because there was nothing symbolic about them. These weren't token gestures for a photo op. The Gates kids did actual, repetitive, unglamorous housework, night after night, in a house that could have afforded a full staff to do it instead. The dishes are the clearest example. Despite running the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the largest private foundation in the world, with assets worth almost $47 billion, the family still shared the housework, and washing the dishes together almost every night was a Gates tradition. Every night. Not once a week for appearances. Every night, as a standing habit in the family calendar. And there was a reason behind it beyond just cleanliness. Melinda came up with the idea to emphasize that this unpaid chore shouldn't fall on women more than men, and she believed dishwashing made their relationship as a couple and as a family stronger. This wasn't random. It was a deliberate move to model something about fairness at home, using the most mundane task available, a sink full of dirty plates, as the tool to do it. The chores didn't stop at the sink either. Rory and his sisters were regularly asked to complete household chores growing up, like taking out the trash. You know, like other average American kids, trash duty. In a house the size of a hotel. That detail alone tells you the Gates parents weren't interested in outsourcing every unpleasant task just because they had the means to. Now pair that with the allowance system, because this is where the money conversation actually starts for these kids. Long before anyone's talking about billions, the Gates kids had always earned their own allowances, budgeted their spending, and learned that nothing arrives on a silver platter. Earned, not handed over. The word earned is doing a lot of work there. It means there was a system, some kind of exchange, tied to behavior or work, not just a blank check, because their dad happened to be the richest man alive at various points. And Melinda was explicit that this wasn't accidental. It was a philosophy she repeated to them directly. She told them, in her own words, that despite everything different about their family, I just tried to keep them in the real world and point things out to them as much as possible. We had real discussions about how our family was different, but you shouldn't think any more of yourself because of that. That's a mother sitting her kids down and telling them out loud. Don't let this money change how you see yourself relative to other people. This ties directly into how the family thought about entitlement more broadly. The lesson wasn't just do your chores. It was your name and your father's bank account don't buy you out of doing what everyone else does. Remember Gates' own line about the video games. It's not a favor to a kid if just because you're his daughter, you get to skip the rules everyone else follows. That same logic ran through the chores. Taking out the trash wasn't punishment. It was the baseline expectation, no matter what was sitting in the family's investment accounts. There's a version of extreme wealth where kids get raised by staff, never touch a dish, never carry out a trash bag, and float through childhood without friction. The Gates house deliberately built friction back in. Not enough to make life hard. Nobody's arguing these kids struggled for anything material. but enough that a chore list existed and had teeth. And it wasn't just Melinda pushing this. Gates himself, when talking about screen time and privilege, kept circling back to the same idea. Status in the family didn't buy you a pass on responsibility. If anything, being a Gates kid seemed to mean a slightly higher bar, not a lower one, because the parents were consciously working against what wealth normally does to kids. Consider the scale of what these kids were surrounded by, and then consider that scale next to a sink full of dishes. Phoebe was born into a house in Medina, Washington, that Gates spent 7 years and $63 million building, spanning 66,000 square feet with 7 bedrooms and 24 bathrooms. 24 bathrooms, and somewhere among them, a kitchen sink the kids were expected to stand at night after night, doing dishes by hand. That contrast is the whole story of this household. Extraordinary wealth on one side of the ledger, ordinary expectations on the other, and the parents actively working to keep those two things from blending into one identity for their kids. It's also worth noting how this fits with what other ultra-wealthy families in the same social circle were doing at the time. Mark Cuban paid his son not to watch certain videos and made him earn screen time through math problems. A similar instinct, using small transactional systems to build discipline rather than letting money remove the need for it entirely. Gates and Melinda were doing their own version of that same experiment, just with dish soap and a trash can instead of a video-watching ban. But chores and allowance were really just the training ground. The bigger, more consequential rule, the one that shaped how these 3 kids would think about their entire adult lives, was still coming. It had to do with hiding who they even were in the first place. Because before the Gates kids ever had to think about money, they had to deal with something even more basic: not being recognized as Bill Gates's children at all. This is maybe the least talked about rule, and it might be the strangest one of all. For years, 2 of the 3 Gates kids didn't even go by the name Gates. Of the 3 Gates kids didn't even go by the name Gates. Until middle school, the girls used Melinda's maiden name, French, at school instead of Gates, and Rory continued using the French name throughout high school. Read that again? The son of the world's richest man spent his entire high school career going by a different last name. Specifically so, classmates and teachers wouldn't immediately clock who his father was. This wasn't an accident of paperwork. It was a decision made on purpose to buy the kids years of anonymity they otherwise never would have had. In a Vogue interview, Melinda revealed that the family set up certain systems specifically to shield the children from instant recognition. Systems, plural. This was engineered, and the reasoning behind it lines up with everything else in this house. She often reminded them, "You shouldn't think any more of yourself because of that," meaning because you are a billionaire's child. And their moral compass was never meant to come from wealth or last names, but from character. The name switch wasn't just about privacy from outsiders. It was about the kids themselves, making sure they didn't build an identity around 3 syllables that happened to open every door in the world. Phoebe talked about this too, in her own words, wanting something that had nothing to do with the family fortune attached to it. Phoebe, who attended Lakeside School in Seattle, the same elite school her father once attended, shared that she wanted to be known simply as Phoebe. Not only as the child of tech tycoon Bill Gates, all 3 kids at various points went through the same private school their dad went to in the same city and still tried to keep their own name off the table as long as they possibly could. The rules didn't stop at what name showed up on a class roster either. Gates' own presence around school got restricted, on purpose by Melinda's design. Even Bill's involvement came with rules aimed at giving the kids space to settle in without a spectacle. He was not allowed to drop them off for the first 2 or 3 weeks of a new school year, Melinda said. Think about that. The richest man on the planet banned from his own kids' school drop-off for weeks at a time. Every single year, a new school started. Not because he didn't want to be there, because his presence alone would turn the parking lot into an event. Once that window passed, he was allowed back in, and it became something he actually loved. After that adjustment period, Bill was free to drive them, and he cherished those morning conversations and long drives. He even fought to make it happen more, not less. He had pushed for a school that was farther away, promising, "I will drive her every day," a longer commute on purpose, just so he'd get more time in the car with his daughter before the school day swallowed her up. And there's a small detail buried in that story that says everything about how normal these kids' school lives actually looked on the surface. Once he started doing the school run regularly, other fathers soon began showing up too. Many mothers went home and told their husbands that if Bill Gates could find the time to drive his child to school, so could they. The world's most famous tech billionaire, quietly resetting the norm for an entire school parking lot just by consistently showing up like every other parent. All three kids ended up at the same school their father did. All three reportedly attended high school at Dad Bill's alma mater, Lakeside School, a private prep school in Seattle where Bill grew up and where he and Melinda raised their kids. Same hallways, same campus, decades apart. Except this generation was going by a different last name for a chunk of it, trying to slide through those hallways without the weight of Gates attached. Even outside school, the effort to keep things low-key continued. Silicon Valley children reportedly spend less time on screens compared to their peers across America, according to a survey done by The Information, suggesting this wasn't just a Gates quirk, but part of a broader pattern among tech families, trying to keep their kids' lives smaller and quieter than their parents' public profiles would suggest. Melinda's own upbringing shaped a lot of this thinking too. She wasn't born into money. She came from a background that made her acutely aware of what extreme wealth can do to a kid's sense of self if nobody pushes back on it. Raised in Dallas by an aerospace engineer father and a homemaker mother, Melinda grew up with firm middle-class values and an acute awareness of how privilege can warp young personalities, and she carefully designed her children's upbringing rather than letting their circumstances shape them by default. That's the through line connecting the fake last names, the delayed school drop-offs, the dish duty, and the phone ban. None of it was random. It was one coordinated effort to keep three kids from ever fully absorbing just how much money and power surrounded them at all times. But there was one rule still waiting in the wings that would eventually blow past all of it. The one about what actually happens to the money itself. Once these kids grow up and their father isn't around to enforce any of this anymore. That's the rule that made headlines around the world. And it's the one most people think of first when they hear Bill Gates' kids. It's time to get into the inheritance. Here's the rule that turned heads outside the family entirely. The one about what Jennifer, Rory, and Phoebe actually get to keep when it's all said and done. Gates first put a number on it publicly years ago, and the number was almost comically small next to his overall fortune. In 2016, Bill Gates made it known that when he dies, his children are not inheriting his billions. He's setting aside $10 million apiece for Jennifer, Rory, and Phoebe, $10 million each. Life-changing money for almost anyone on Earth. And at the same time, a rounding error against a fortune that at the time sat well over $100 billion. He didn't dress up the reasoning. He said it straight to a reporter's face on live television. Our kids will receive a great education and some money, so they are never going to be poorly off, but they'll go out and have their own career, he said. It's not a favor to kids to have them have huge sums of wealth. It distorts anything they might do creating their own path. That's the entire philosophy in one breath. Enough to be comfortable, not enough to remove the need to build something themselves. The number has shifted a bit over time as his fortune kept growing, but the underlying rule never changed. More recently, on a podcast appearance, Gates reframed it in terms of percentage rather than a flat number. Everybody gets to decide on that, he said. In my case, my kids got a great upbringing and education, but less than 1% of the total wealth. It's not a dynasty. I'm not asking them to run Microsoft. Even phrased as a percentage instead of a dollar figure, the message stayed exactly the same as it was back in 2016, a firm ceiling on what money means to move from one generation to the next. And because his overall fortune has kept climbing, even as the percentage stays capped, the actual dollar figure the kids stand to inherit has quietly ballooned despite Gates holding the line on principle. Bill Gates' 3 kids are each expected to inherit less than 1% of his fortune, which by some estimates could still work out to $500 million or more per child. So even a rule designed to keep the kids from getting too much still leaves each of them with an amount most people will never see in 10 lifetimes. The restriction is real. The floor it lands on is still enormous. Where the money isn't going matters just as much as where it isn't staying. After passing on a small amount of money to their offspring, Gates and his ex-wife Melinda will give the rest of their fortune to their charity, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which funds health and education projects around the world. The bulk of one of the largest fortunes ever assembled is being funneled somewhere other than the family bloodline, on purpose, as a matter of stated policy. This wasn't a lone wolf decision either. Gates sits inside a small circle of extremely wealthy people who've made the exact same call, which suggests something bigger than one father's personal quirk. Mark Zuckerberg, worth around $90 billion, won't be sharing the majority of his money with his daughters either. In a 2015 letter to their newborn daughter, he and wife Priscilla Chan pledged to give away 99% of their company shares. Same instinct. Same generation of tech wealth, same conclusion. Don't let the kids inherit the whole thing. Warren Buffett, a close friend of Gates and a fellow founder of the Giving Pledge, has said the same thing in blunter terms. It is about having a work ethic. I don't believe in inherited money at all, he told the Daily Mirror. I am not in favor of children suddenly finding a lot of money coming their way, because then they have no incentive to work. That's the same worry Gates has voiced, just delivered with Buffett's characteristic bluntness. Now here's where it gets personal, because these aren't hypothetical kids anymore. They're adults, and they've had to actually live inside this rule. Jennifer, the eldest, has never publicly complained about the ceiling on her inheritance. If anything, her path suggests she absorbed the lesson exactly as intended. She built a career in medicine rather than leaning on the family name. Jennifer Catherine Gates, Nasser, the oldest, was born in 1996 and became a pediatrician after graduating from Mount Sinai's medical school in 2024. Years of medical school, residencies, exams, the long, slow, ordinary route into a demanding profession, despite having a father who could have made almost any door open instantly. Rory has taken the rule in a different direction entirely, leaning into privacy rather than public visibility. At 26, he's the most private of the 3, unlike his sisters avoiding the spotlight entirely, focusing instead on his education and career. He's got a master's degree from the University of Chicago and is working on a PhD. No headlines chasing him, no social feed dissecting his spending, just a guy quietly working on advanced degrees, largely off the public record. And Phoebe, the youngest, has taken the most public route of all 3, using her platform in a way that seems designed to build something of her own, rather than simply enjoy what her father already has. Phoebe Adele Gates graduated from Stanford in 2024 and has since co-founded a sustainable fashion platform called FIA, and also has a podcast called The Burnouts, where she talks about mental health and Gen Z struggles. A startup, a podcast, her own name attached to her own projects, not her father's company, not her father's causes. 3 very different paths, out of the same rule, from the same house. That's not an accident either. It's arguably the entire point of drawing the inheritance line where Gates drew it in the first place. But the story doesn't stop at the inheritance rule itself. What actually happened once these 3 kids grew up, moved out, and had to live the rest of their lives under the weight, or maybe the shelter, of everything their parents built into their childhood is where this whole thing lands. So where did all of this actually leave Jennifer, Rory, and Phoebe once they were fully grown and out from under their parents' roof? Start with Jennifer, the kid who wasn't allowed a phone until 14, who did dishes every night, who went by a different last name at points growing up, is now a working pediatrician. She became a pediatrician after graduating from Mount Sinai's medical school in 2024, married Niall Nasser, an Olympic equestrian, and they've since had 2 daughters, Layla and Mia. There's also her long-running passion that her father actually did pour real money into, which tells you the strict rules weren't blanket austerity. they were targeted. A professional show jumper and trained doctor, she began riding horses at just 6 years old, and her father poured millions into her passion, including purchasing a $18 million Californian horse farm and a custom equestrian facility in Wellington, Florida. So the phone ban and the dish duty existed right alongside a multi-million-dollar horse farm. The rules were never about deprivation. They were about which things got unrestricted support and which things got hard limits. Rory's story looks almost like a rebuttal to the entire idea that being a billionaire's kid means public visibility. Rory avoids the spotlight, focusing instead on his education and career, and there's not much out there about his personal life or finances, which is exactly how he seems to like it. Though given the family he comes from, it's safe to assume he's got access to some hefty trust funds, even if he's not flashing them around. The most private of the 3 kids ended up the least covered by any outlet, tabloid or otherwise, which, if the goal all along was raising a kid who didn't need the world's attention to feel secure, looks a lot like the rules working exactly as designed. Phoebe's story is the loudest of the 3 and maybe the clearest proof of how these kids actually processed growing up under the family's rules, rather than resenting them outright. In 2022, she interned at British Vogue and attended fashion weeks in Copenhagen, New York, and Paris, and co-founded Fia, a sustainable fashion tech startup with college roommate Sophia Kiani, a platform that uses a browser extension to track down items across secondhand marketplaces to help consumers find better deals and reduce waste. A kid who wasn't allowed an iPhone until 14 grew up to build a tech company anyway, just one with her own name on it, not her father's. And she's been open in her own voice about the family's approach to money shaping how she sees privilege in general. Phoebe Gates and her siblings weren't allowed to have a cell phone until they turned 14. They complained other kids got them earlier. Bill Gates told the Mirror in 2017, but he couldn't be swayed. Years later, that same daughter is publicly building her own venture instead of coasting, which is about as direct a result as you could ask for from a rule like that. Zoom out, and the pattern across all 3 kids is consistent. None of them inherited a company. None of them are running a division of Microsoft or sitting on the foundation's board by default. Jennifer went through a full medical residency. Rory buried himself in graduate research most people have never heard of. Phoebe started a company from scratch with a roommate using a browser extension idea rather than a trust fund. Each of them, in their own lane, ended up doing something that required actual sustained effort. The exact outcome Gates said he was aiming for when he capped the inheritance and limited the screen time and made them do the dishes every night. None of it means these kids had it hard in any conventional sense. They didn't. They grew up in a house with 24 bathrooms, went to one of the most expensive private schools in the country, and will still walk away with more money than almost anyone on the planet. Even after the less than 1% carve-out, nobody's arguing they struggled the way an average family struggles. But inside that extraordinary bubble, there was a set of rules that acted like ballast: dishes, trash duty, a phone ban that outlasted their friends' patience, a fake last name at school, a father banned from drop-off for the first weeks of the year, and a hard ceiling on what they'd eventually inherit. Every single one of those rules pointed in the same direction. Don't let the money become who you are. Melinda summed up the entire project in one line that ties back to everything covered here: the dishes, the trash, the name switch, the phone ban, the inheritance cap. The idea that the money is not yours was woven into the children's upbringing from the start. Not the money isn't much. Not the money will run out. Just it was never theirs to begin with. It belonged to the mission their parents were building, and their job was to grow up as people first, Gates' kids second. Whether that approach fully worked is something only Jennifer, Rory, and Phoebe can really answer in the decades still ahead of them. But so far, none of them are living off a name. They're living off degrees, careers, companies, and, by every account, a set of house rules that never once bent, no matter how many zeros sat in the family bank account. Sources: CNBC, tech-free dinners, and no smartphones past 10 p.m. Yahoo Finance Benzinga, hidden side of Steve Jobs and Bill Gates. BGR, Bill Gates didn't let his kids use cell phones until they turned 14. Good. Bill Gates explains the safest age to give a kid a cell phone. E-Online. Bill Gates discloses how much money he'll leave his kids. SCMP, Bill Gates and wife Melinda's modest parenting style. House and Whips, Bill Gates' 3 children, names, ages, inheritance, net worth. IB Times UK, Bill Gates' children set to inherit less than 1% of his fortune. Yahoo Finance, Bill Gates and 15 more rich people who won't leave money to their kids. Parade, Bill and Melinda Gates' children, luxury launches. Melinda French Gates protected her children's normalcy. The List, the stunning transformation of Bill Gates' daughter Phoebe. Nicki Swift, the untold truth of Rory John Gates. Entrepreneur, Bill Gates and Steve Jobs raised their kids tech-free. Life in Humanity, the irony